everyone, to Fueling the Future of Community Ownership. Introduce yourselves in the chat, as others are doing, if you feel comfortable. My name is Miriam Axel-Lute. I'm the editor-in-chief of Shelterforce. My pronouns are she, her. And this webinar rounds out our Under the Lens series on innovations in community ownership, which you can find at the link in the chat. This webinar will be recorded and shared, and we will also produce an edited transcript. So for those of you, there may be a few who are not familiar with Shelterforce, we are a national publication covering affordable housing, and we serve everyone who cares about and works toward housing justice, healthy and affordable communities. And we do that with a mix of journalistic reporting, explanatory journalism, and lifting up the voices and lessons from folks who are doing the work, as we have with us today. If you aren't getting our weekly newsletter, please sign up. And that link will also be in the chat. Before we jump in, I do want to note that Shelterforce is in our end of year fundraising drive, and every donation that you make today, this week, through the end of the month will be matched. We are committed to keeping our content free and accessible, and independent journalism is all the more important and embattled right now, but it costs money. And we have a lot of devoted readers who rely on our content, and many of them, individuals and organizations, have already given to us. If that's you, thank you. A few of us have a lot to spare, but if everyone who opened our newsletter regularly gave us $50, we would blow past our fundraising target for this year. So please consider being part of that movement. The link to donate is in the chat, or just put in shelterforce.org/donate. And now to the exciting part. Today, we are going to hear from folks about innovative ways to finance the acquisition of land for community ownership, and about ways to develop the ecosystem that allows community ownership models to both get started and to thrive and really become something more than an outlier. Rubber to the road, real practical questions. We're going to have 3 rounds of discussion with our speakers and then open it up for Q&A. You can put questions for the panelists in the chat. We are currently missing one of our panelists, but I hope that he will make it. And so if he comes in late, we may shuffle our order around to make sure that he can get to his contributions as well. But for now, we're going to start with the 2 panelists that we have right now. We're going to start with Deyanira, and she will introduce herself and talk about the context in which she's working on community ownership. So that's policy context, market context, and the existing infrastructure. Take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Miriam, and everyone for organizing today's webinar. It's really nice to be here with all of you. I'm joining from New York City, where New Economy Project is based. And we're a citywide organization. Our mission is to build an economy that works for all, that's rooted in cooperation, in racial and neighborhood equity, and in ecological sustainability. And the way we do this work is by organizing coalitions and campaigns and other work that both fights against wealth extraction and corporations and policies that are fueling inequality and poverty, and by working with groups to advance community ownership through land trusts, through public banking, and other democratically controlled initiatives that build both power and collective wealth in New York City's low-income and immigrant neighborhoods and Black and Brown communities as well. And so one of the coalitions I'll be talking about today that we've anchored for about a dozen years is the New York City Community Land Initiative. We call it NYCLY. I see many friends and members here today. And this coalition has, over those past dozen years, really fostered the dramatic growth of community land trusts all over New York's 5 boroughs. We had one fully operational CLT when we started this work. And today we have 20 CLTs that are organizing for land and housing justice in every borough of New York City. So that's a pretty impressive and tremendous growth. And this movement that we've helped to create is really, really squarely focused on racial justice, on combating displacement of low-income and Black and Brown New Yorkers, and addressing root causes of our affordability crisis in New York City. About 10 of those community land trusts that I mentioned, 10 of the 20, now have land that they're stewarding, or they have land in their pipelines to create and preserve permanently affordable housing, both deeply affordable rentals, as well as shared equity home ownership through co-ops. They're also doing commercial and community spaces. They're preserving green and waterfront spaces and meeting a real broad array of neighborhood needs. And there's an interactive map. I don't know if it's been dropped in the chat, but we this year launched an interactive map that we'll share that you can click on to read about all of these groups and their specific projects across New York. I'll just say that this has been a tremendous lift, not just for our organization, but for the dozens of groups that make up nicely this tremendous coalition. And we've really done this movement building through coalition building, not only with community land trust, but with the tenant movement, with nonprofit developers, with the environmental justice movement here, and many others. And we've carried out pretty relentless organizing, community education and outreach, policy advocacy, and much more. So I'm excited to share with you some of our updates and progress that we've made, and to hear from others also in this space. So thanks everyone for having us.
Wonderful. Chris, do you want to go next to introduce yourself and the context that you're working in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Miriam. Hi, everyone. Chris Brown. My pronouns are he, him. So I'm broadly located in New York State's Hudson Valley region, which encompasses about 9 counties on either side of the Hudson River, all within about 2 hours of the New York City MSA. And we really feel that proximity here in the region, especially in the last 5 years. So one of the hats that I wear is the vice president of the Trillium Community Land Trust. This is a pretty much brand new CLT. There's our website in the chat. We were founded at the state level in December of 2023, still searching for first property acquisitions, but we have a number of potential collaborations and actual collaborations, which I think we'll get into a little bit more during the course of the conversation. Our Community Land Trust is also a member organization of a coalition of 16 different organizations, again, on either side of the Hudson River, within that kind of 2-hour corridor of New York City. That coalition is the Hudson Valley Alliance for Conservation and Affordable Housing, or Affordable Housing and Conservation, depending on who's speaking. That's 8 land organizations, so land conservancies, and then 8 affordable housing organizations. And it was really created sort of with the idea in mind of these are 2 things that are not only near and dear to people in this region, but are also really essential. Affordable housing is always essential for our workforce and for other folks. And conservation is very essential in our area, somewhat because of the food production. Columbia County and the Hudson Valley writ large is responsible for much of the food production of New York State, but also there are some real bioessential kind of land use situations throughout our region that we have to be very careful that we're not stepping on too many toes when we talk about development. So the idea of the alliance, or the Conservation Alliance, the Conservation Housing Alliance, was if you have to have housing and you have to have conservation, these 2 systems should be working in concert instead of opposed to each other, which is sort of the baseline assumption. And we have found that there is quite a bit of overlap when these 2 organizations or types of organizations come to the table and start to get involved in co-development / preservation spaces. So we've been looking at a lot of cluster development issues, a lot of aside from just the physical space, a lot of use issues that kind of, I think, lead directly into the community-controlled conversation. This region has also kind of the broader context of our housing situation. This region has hosted at various times in the past 5 years the hottest zip codes in the country as far as year-over-year median home sale prices. It seems to not really be slowing down for our region. Columbia County, the county that I live in and do most of my work in, Columbia County recently became kind of the poster child for housing price escalation in New York State. We are now the least affordable county outside of the New York City metropolitan statistical area. Our median home sales price has more than doubled in the past 7 years. And during that time, real local wages have gone up about 6%. So we are seeing a lot of the effects of working from home. We are now one of the counties in all of New York State, one of the counties with the highest proportion of employees that work from home. And by and large, those occupations that those folks belong to, those occupations are located in and around New York City and pay much more than local wages do, which of course leads to the displacement issues that we're seeing. So we have been lucky enough. I have to be careful about we. That's almost like jargon. It's a lot of hats, and I think everybody on the call has a lot of hats. So the Community Land Trust, Trillium, has been lucky to win a couple of pretty new state grants. New York State has a program that they're specifically calling community-controlled affordable housing. There have been 2 rounds of that. A third round, I believe, is opening soon or is currently open and is closing soon. So we've won a couple of rounds of that. We've won some grants from local funders, a couple of foundations. But most importantly, we've really created a network of collaborators and potential collaborators. And like I said, we haven't quite located our first project yet, which one we're going to go with. But that is because we are suffering from the issue of a plethora of options before us, rather than a very narrow field. And just for, I guess, tone setting, our area specifically is extremely rural, but the Hudson Valley region writ large is rural in and of itself. There are only 3 communities in the Hudson Valley region that have more than 50,000 people within them. So just a little bit of context for the degree of development and degree of densification that we exist in. And I think that's it until we get into the main portion.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome, Roberto. Glad you were able to come in. Can you introduce yourself? And then we're giving the context of where we're working. So in your case, that would also involve the existence of Measure ULA and what that is. And then you can get into the specifics of how it addresses community ownership in the next round.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry I was a little late. I got my times wrong. But yeah, my name is Roberto Garcia Ceballos. I'm a co-founder, former co-director of Fideicomiso Comuniatario Tierra Libre, which is a community land trust in East LA and Boyle Heights in the city of LA. I'm also a co-founder, or Fideicomiso is also a co-founder of the LA CLT Coalition, which I'll speak about in terms of context. The work I'm going to be talking about is situated in the city of LA, in a housing market under extreme pressure, skyrocketing rent, escalating real estate values, gentrification, all of the displacements. As a city, we're also gonna host the Olympics, and we're also going to be hosting the World Cup. And so we're feeling, and then a lot of other pressures from the federal government as an immigrant city as well. But I'm going to be sharing in terms of the infrastructure that we've been building out. So over the past 6 years, Fideicomiso and other CLTs and other community-based groups and affordable housing developers have been, we've seen a meaningful shift in community ownership infrastructure. So in LA in 2019, the LA CLT Coalition was founded. And at the time, there were 2 established community land trusts in the city and 3 emerging ones, including Fideicomiso. Now in 2025, we are now 6 established CLTs with 1 emerging CLT, which is Chinatown, the LA Chinatown Community Land Trust, and with more being developed, including 1 in San Gabriel and 1 in Altadena in response to the LA fires that just happened. What has really helped build this infrastructure? So in 2020, one of our early wins, we secured a $14 million pilot program for LA County, where CLTs were able to use these funds to acquire naturally occurring affordable housing to really pilot community land trusts, building permanently affordable housing. So that kind of really triggered a lot of the work that we do. And then in 2022, we passed a really important ballot measure called Measure ULA via the United to House LA coalition. And this is a voter-approved real estate transfer tax, which went into effect April 1st, 2023. It imposes an additional tax on high-value real estate transfers, 4% on properties over 5 million, 5% over transfers over 10 million in the city of LA, which revenues are dedicated to affordable housing, homeless prevention, and most importantly, alternative housing models, or what we call social housing, which includes a lot of community ownership. Yeah, and so I think that these specific policies have been really key in developing community ownership infrastructure outside of just having scattered CLTs doing work. I think this is really helping us think about how we build this model at scale. And just this year, I think Measure ULA has collected $800 million. And so that's the type of funding that's coming into our city to be able to do this work. But it does require a lot of coalition work. It does require making sure that 800, I said 800 million. We're getting close to $1 billion, and it's not the end of the year. And so, yeah, that's, yeah. And so my role specifically and my focus has been within this ecosystem to help expand the capacity of CLTs, advocate for funding and policy levers, and participate in building institutions. And so I mentioned that I'm now the former co-director of Fideicomiso because I'm actually moving into a new role where we're building out a new institution, which I'll share in the next round, which is called the LA Housing Training Hub, which is part of ULA to do capacity building for a lot of these new alternative housing models that we're experimenting in LA. And I'll pause there.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all. So having set that stage, obviously one of the things that everybody is most concerned about is how we get the land, how we get the money to develop the housing on the land. And so let's get a little more in detail about some of the ways that you guys are working on that. And let's start with Chris, and you can talk to us a little bit more about how you're partnering with conservation groups, what that can look like on the ground, and also that specific state funding that you mentioned.
Yeah, so there's actually a couple different paths that we're exploring that have all been bearing some type of fruit. One is find an organization that's already doing some housing development and ask them if they want to sell you their land, right? So we've got a couple of different nonprofit developers of various capacities, various scales throughout the region and throughout the county. We're pretty the Community Land Trust is pretty friendly with all, or if not most of them. So having conversations with those developers pretty early on in their pre-development process, in some cases before they've even won their grants, that has helped tremendously to sort of start at the beginning of a project with the intention for that project to have a longer period of affordability than most subsidy programs generally accrue to themselves. Usually in New York, our subsidy periods run either 10 or 15 years for a period of affordability, and then folks who purchase a subsidized home are free to sell their homes for as much as they'd like to. It's very similar to at the federal level. You see one of the big issues that we're having kind of nationally is the expiration of many of the 30-year low-income housing tax credit developments. A lot of those properties that have been affordable since their inception likely won't be once those tax credits expire. We're also seeing that in our rural communities with the USDA 515 programs, which are somewhat similar, but a smaller scale. Again, these are just subsidies that are expiring unless someone does something at the policy level to change that. So we've been basically, the CLT has been looking to right off the bat start with a longer period of affordability than some of the projects were initially incepted to have. So going beyond those 10 or 15 years. And to their credit, New York State, or at least the housing agencies at the state level, have really started to pick up the ball with that. A lot of the newer housing subsidy programs, both rental and homeownership, either have longer periods of affordability baked into them. They have some sort of potential path where you could add years of affordability to them, or they are just explicitly community controlled models. New York State, if there's anybody in the state right now, there's a very undersubscribed and little known pair of programs from, I think, not last year's budget, but the year before, New York State Housing for the Future. So this is two separate buckets of $75 million that have to be spent outside of New York City. 75 million for rentals, 75 million for homeownership. They both go up to a fairly decent income level. And they both are specifically looking for things like limited equity co-ops, community land trust homeownership models. So New York State is really leaning into longer periods of affordability. As Miriam mentioned, there's the specific community controlled affordable housing grant program. It's pretty small, the pool of money right now. Each round, there's a successively larger amount of funding available. I think the idea is that you've got one project that goes through all three phases of the grant funding. But there are other grant sources out there that you can utilize. I can really only speak to New York State, but I'm sure that there are some at the federal level. There's nothing stopping someone from applying for Federal Home Loan Bank of New York subsidies and then citing those subsidized homes on community controlled land. So there are some workarounds that you can kind of squeeze in on the edges. Partnering with conservation groups or local conservation groups has actually been much more productive than I initially thought it would be. A full disclosure, I got onboarded into this alliance of land conservation and affordable housing groups. They said, "What questions do you have?" And my first question was, "Can you give us some land?" And that it's not quite how those two groups are working together. But there are some real gains at the margins. The land conservancy organizations in this area understand that their mission is unfulfillable if there aren't enough people in the area that live here that care about the actual the environment. Otherwise, you just get people that treat it like a vacation destination and don't really have any connection to the land. They're also starting to understand that they can't sustainably employ anyone unless they start caring about affordable housing. They've got pretty sizable staffs, and increasingly the folks on those staffs are priced out of our region. There's one thing I wanted to hit on in the intro that I didn't quite touch on that's really important for rural areas, certainly ours, but to a larger extent throughout the Midwest and then farther west as well. The rise of private equity acquiring manufactured home communities has become one of, if not the biggest issue with in the world of rural affordable housing. There's been something like a 45% increase in rents in manufactured homes in the past 5 to 6 years. Private equity is, snapping up these, what we would call in the housing field, naturally occurring affordable housing. Typically, this is housing that you don't need to subsidize because manufactured homes tend to be affordable just by the nature of being manufactured homes. And that is disappearing on a really large level across the country. 3 years ago, I think I had a conversation with someone about community land trusts getting involved in the manufactured housing community space. And they said, "Oh, you don't need to do that. You don't need to ensure long-term affordability because those places will always be affordable." 2.5 years later, we're seeing that is not true. So we have been talking to some of our manufactured housing communities and trying to connect them with, if anyone is unfamiliar with an organization, Resident-Owned Communities USA, just ROC USA. ROC USA is they're not the only game in town, but they are far and away the biggest game in town when it comes to organizing manufactured home community residents to get ahead of the game. You know, if they get the right of first refusal, if their park community goes on sale. So that's something that we're paying a lot of attention to. We in this case is my day job of the housing development coordinator for my county. We've started a survey of all the manufactured home communities in our county and neighboring counties, and are hoping to pick up some more information from surrounding counties within the region. But that is one of the best ways in our environment, in our rural environment, to turn what could have been, you know, a horrible story about half of a community being evicted from their homes. It's about a 50% eviction rate when these communities are purchased by private equity firms. So that is one of the biggest levers that we've got right now from kind of a preemptive standpoint. There's not a ton of money out there for folks to organize in that way. And that's something that we've been having a conversation with the state about. Wouldn't it be a great use of the funds that you've earmarked for the community controlled affordable housing programs to go into keeping people in homes that have been and should stay affordable going forward?
That's great. And several super important things. Shelterforce has definitely been covering the resident-owned communities movement for a while. So we're going to move from rural for a moment to urban and go back to Roberto. So you mentioned Measure ULA, and can you tell us more about how it's structured, how it got to be putting money aside for community ownership, and how that money is being used?
Yes, I could explain some of that. So yeah, so the coalition behind ULA includes unions, tenant organizations, and community advocates. And within the ballot, we insisted to include language that directed funds to diverse affordable housing approaches, not just like the standard subsidized like light tech programs. Um, because in the past we had passed different measures. We've already passed different measures in LA to try to solve this housing crisis. And all that funding goes into subsidizing light tech. Um, and it didn't really create space for community ownership models, alternative housing models, or shared equity models. Um, and so in the guidelines, in the way the policy is written, it has very protected programs. So the funding has to specifically be used for this. And like I said, I think ULA has about like 11 programs that it funds. Within those 11 programs, there's a program for alternative models of permanent housing. That's what it's called. Which requires it requires CLTs, co-ops, nonprofits to have meaningful participation in governance of the projects, and they need to be permanently affordable. And so for us, that was like really key just to have revenue that is marked for these kinds of models, and that it can't be moved or changed. So that funding allocation can't be moved to something else if the city is in a deficit, or it really has to be for that. And so two of the programs that I will talk about right now is the new construction of alternative housing models. The city just released its first notice of funding for this specific fund. And this year, the funding allocated was $101 million. And so these developments must demonstrate that they are alternative models, whether it's a CLT, a co-op, or other permanently affordable shared equity models. And they must have proof of meaningful resident governance in them. And the other program is the Acquisition and Rehabilitation Fund. And that this year, which will go into next year in terms of the notice funding, allocated about 50 million for this specific fund. And it's set aside for CLTs and nonprofits to acquire existing buildings or land, or to be able to rehabilitate it and make it into permanently affordable housing. So those are like two of the specific programs. And then the other, it is a program, but it exists within these two, and it's called the Capacity Building and Technical Assistance. And it's a dedicated program under ULA to build up organizational capacity of CLTs and co-ops and help with governance models, resident engagement, and finance structuring. And this needs to be done through a nonprofit. And so through this specific pot of funding, which is 1% of all funding for ULA, it would generate about $6 to $8 million a year for specific capacity building. And so for us, this is why we're building a new institution in LA, which is called the LA Housing Training Hub. And I'll talk about it in the next round. And I keep saying I'll talk about it in the next round. But yeah, I think some of the challenges for this is, ULA is a new revenue stream. And there's just been a lot of complications in implementation. Specifically making sure that we had the permanent guidelines that we wanted as a community. And so there was a period of time where a lot of us are advocating to ensure that we got the program that we wanted. Yeah, and I think some of the things that are still being hashed out, because LA hasn't had this sort of infrastructure in many years. I think the city is, and specifically like the housing department, is trying to figure out how to create regulatory agreements and how to create the right policy to ensure the compliance of these new types of models in our city. And so, yeah, and then I think one of the other challenges is that ULA is consistently being attacked. And so there's consistent threat at a state level in terms of having ballot measures that will revoke ULA, and then at a city level as well. And so for us, as we're trying to implement, we're also trying to defend this specific policy from being taken from us. And so it's this constant feeling that as we're building, we're also protecting, and that's been a really difficult task. But yeah, I think I'll stop there.
For the New York angle, New York City angle.
Sure. Yes. Thanks. That's so we do a lot of learning exchanges with mission aligned CLTs and CLT networks, including those in LA, and it's been really inspiring to hear and share some of these these big steps, these leaps forward that we've made while also defending against the anticipated attacks. So here in New York City, I was going to focus on a couple of things in this round, which include our policy campaigns that we're waging with community land trusts and a broad coalition, actually, of 150 other groups, as well as a new economy loan fund that we've expanded to help meet some of the needs of New York City's community land trusts. So at the city level, we've been advocating for the past several years for a package of bills that we call the Community Land Act. And these bills would basically create new opportunities for community land trusts and other community-driven nonprofits to bring land and housing into community ownership. And it includes bills that would require the city, for example, to prioritize CLTs and community ownership when the city has public land that it's going to be developing for affordable housing or community and commercial space or whatever it is. Another bill that's central in the Community Land Act is COPA, the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, which of course has passed in San Francisco and a couple of other places around the country. And what the bill would do in New York is allow community land trusts and other qualified nonprofits to have a first right to buy certain multifamily buildings when a landlord decides to sell. And we co-drafted and been fighting for this bill for about 5 years now. And we've made huge progress. We were just this morning at a rally with 150 other groups on the steps of City Hall, celebrating that we've secured a veto-proof supermajority in the City Council of sponsors to advance COPA. We're pushing really hard for the current council to bring it to a vote this year. And there's other bills as well that we were rallying for that would, dramatically expand basically pipelines for community land trusts and others to take land and housing off of the speculative market for good. So we're very excited about that. It's going to come with a lot of other funding demands and things like that. So that's at the local level. This builds also on funding that we've been able to secure from New York City since about 2019, when we were able to work with the City Council to get funding in the city's budget to support community land trusts, that their organizing expenses, operating expenses, as well as citywide technical assistance for these growing CLTs. The 20 plus CLTs that I mentioned are emerging or established across our city. And so we've been able to secure about $1.5 million per year through that funding initiative. That's really helped sort of seed and catalyze some of the community land trusts that we're getting off the ground. And it's strengthened, policymakers' understanding of CLTs, which has kind of paved the way for us to go back with broader policy demands now. At the state level, you heard about the Community Controlled Affordable Housing Program from Chris. He mentioned that. That's supporting CLTs and other groups statewide. We also just this year were able to secure funding for New York City CLTs. Again, more operating support for local land trusts that are doing affordable housing development. And so, these are some of the, ways that we're building capacity and infrastructure to sustain CLTs. At the state level, we've also been waging a really big campaign to win TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. Very similar to COPA, but this would be statewide. It would apply to a broader universe of properties. And it would give tenants the first right to organize and make collective bids to purchase their buildings and bring it into resident control. So very similar to COPA. We've been co-leading that campaign with Housing Justice for All, the statewide tenant coalition that won these pretty groundbreaking rent reform laws in 2019. And those were, all of these campaigns also have been very helpful in fostering on the ground partnerships between tenants that are organizing in their buildings and community land trusts and other mission-driven nonprofits. And through those relationships, there have been a growing number of what we call tenant takeover campaigns, where tenants and CLTs are working together to bring landlords to the table, to bring enforcement agencies to the table where landlords have a number of violations and there's other leverage, and really to facilitate transfers, to ways that the tenants with community land trusts and other partners can collectively buy their buildings from their landlords. The East New York CLT did this about a year and a half ago. That's one of the recent examples. They were able to bring a 20-unit building into community ownership, and the residents now are working with the CLT to make the repairs that they've been fighting for a number of years. And it's been a really inspiring model for others to replicate. TOPA or COPA, either one of these bills passing, would basically strengthen and help multiply those kinds of campaigns around the city. So we're incredibly excited about this and gearing up for all the implementation kind of steps that will follow. We also had New Economy Project. We have a loan fund that is specifically created to make no interest and low interest loans in community ownership. So it's about a $2.5 million fund. We're looking to double it in the next couple of years. And we've put out about 1.3 million in loans, 0 interest to 3%, 4% interest loans. And we're supporting community land trusts. with pre-development and rehab loans. We've just expanded our loan capacity to be able to make up to $500,000 towards acquisitions and other expenses. We've also supported worker-owned businesses and community solar projects and a number of other non-housing, non-CLT kinds of projects around the city. So we're incredibly excited to keep growing that. It's an emerging CDFI. We've gotten some federal technical assistance awards to support the growth of our loan fund. And we're in the process of applying for certification. And anyone who knows about the federal CDFI fund know that we have impeccable timing to be applying right now. But we are hopeful that this program, this fund will continue to exist, and that'll open up some additional opportunities for us to be able to build up our fund. What we're doing, obviously, we're not, even if we double to 5 million, it's relatively modest, but what we're doing is making really creative strategic loans that can fill gaps, pre-development financing that can be really hard to get, that then opens up a much bigger pool of, next stage financing for projects. For example, we've also partnered with lots of other mission-aligned lenders to be able to bring more capital into the space. And, that's going to be, I think, a piece of the puzzle for COPA or TOPA implementation, is to have some nimble private sources of funding for groups that want to seize these acquisition opportunities that will suddenly be before them, or that they've been organizing towards for many years. And, while they're waiting and applying for public financing and other permanent capital. I would just want to add a last thing here, which is that, all of this infrastructure we're developing, and some more that we'll talk about in the next round, it's really being shaped by and meant to support the organizing campaigns by CLTs on the ground that, I mentioned the East New York example. There's other CLTs that have been working to redevelop vacant and blighted public land in the city. So there are groups that have successfully organized and pushed the city, for example, to put out RFPs on sites that the city owns right now and isn't using, and putting out RFPs that the CLTs have called for to redevelop, a vacant site in the South Bronx into a health, education, and arts center. There's a site in Western Queens that the city, under the last administration and state, actually, we're going to give away to Amazon as a headquarters, its second headquarters. And the community fought back, defeated that plan. And then a lot of the groups and residents and activists that were in that campaign then formed a community land trust and came up with their own community-led proposal plan for the same site. And so they recently pushed and got the city to put out a request for, basically expressions of interest to develop the site. And they're moving forward on that as well. So there's tons of tremendous organizing that has also created pipelines for the CLTs now, and also really made the case for these much bigger policy demands that we're making together.
It is so great to hear good news and good things happening. So thank you all for sharing those. Usually we do our Q&A at the end, but actually I wanted to ask a couple specific questions that were about these particular things that you just mentioned that have come in. Roberto, there were two questions for you. One was just, does the ULA funding, is it limited to the city of Los Angeles, or like it is, so not unincorporated parts?
Yeah, it's not yeah, it doesn't cover the other cities in LA. LA County has 88 cities, so it covers one of the cities, which is the biggest city. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the other question for you was, who is it who's trying to get rid of ULA?
Oh, there's a long list. But I think the biggest hurdle we overcame was a lawsuit from the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association. This lawsuit really delayed the implementation of ULA. ULA started collecting money immediately, but we couldn't spend it because of this lawsuit that we went through. Luckily, we've won it, but now the same organization and groups across the state, specifically apartment associations and other real estate developers, are now threatening to move on a a statewide ballot initiative that would overturn not just ULA, but potentially other ballot measures across the state that are. And so I think so that's like a huge threat that we're kind of like worried about. And in the grapevine of what's happening, we're also hearing that there might be attempts to amend ULA using city council next year. It was, and then there was a threat earlier, like maybe like 2 months ago, where our own mayor tried to make a move during the state legislation. And so we are, these are the type of context that I mean by like, this is the type of pressure we're feeling uh, and having to like balance the defense and the implementation of ULA.
Great, thanks. And then I wanted to ask a question to Chris about going back to the working with conservation organizations. I believe that I know of a case in Connecticut, and I think I heard that there was a case in the Hudson Valley also. It might not have been for a land trust, where there's something like a farm that is being sold. The farmer may have passed on, and that there can be an arrangement where the woodlot or the farming part remains in conservation, but the part where there was already buildings can be developed for housing. Is that, are you having conversations like that? Is that something that has come up in that partnership?
Yes, I don't want to, can't speak to the specifics of that project too in depth, but there were, I believe, about 110 acres of farmland along one of our main county highways that runs really throughout the region, our county into the next. About 110 acres, and the southernmost 10 or so acres were pretty close to a village center that had some form of infrastructure. That's one of the big challenges of developing anything in our area, is the lack of infrastructure. I believe the framework is 100 of those 110 acres will be sold to kind of smaller scale farmers instead of just one massive operation. And then those last 10 acres will be given over to some kind of permanently, well, long-term affordable housing arrangements, whether that's, I think it's going to be some combination of rental and home ownership. But those are the exact kinds of, oh, and the really important part of that entire project is that it was made possible. So the 110 acres were purchased from the private market by the town itself. So this is the town of Red Hook, New York. And the only way that they were able to make that purchase happen was they tapped into an incentive zoning fund bank that they essentially had. So for a little over a decade, I believe, they had an incentive zoning law on the books that if you were a developer that came in, if you wanted to acquire additional density, you could pay into a fund, or you can make some of the additional density units. You could make some of those affordable. By and large, developers would rather pay into a fund than make some portion of those units affordable, or at least it was the case in Red Hook. So over the years, they built up a pretty significant kind of treasure chest of funding that they could use. And much of those funds, if not all of them, I think they might have depleted that funding source to purchase those 110 acres from the private market. So yeah, we've had multiple conversations around those types of opportunities where we know that there's a project going forward, and we know that it's being undertaken by what we might consider a friendly developer, and that's probably the biggest one that we've been kind of circling in the past few months. I also, just because I've got the mic for a second, I wanted to give a shout out to all the New York area community land trusts, because I see we've got people from Enterprise Community Partners on there. A lot of the New York City land banks, and then two of us upstate, or land trusts, excuse me, and then two of the CLTs upstate were part of like a technical assistance training that took place over the course of a year. So really big shout out to the supporting organizations too, that aren't necessarily, boots on the ground, but do a lot of the work that makes our work possible.
Here, here. Do any of you have questions for each other before we shift a little bit to talk about the training and infrastructure? Okay, great. So as I mentioned before, this work takes a lot of infrastructure. It takes a lot of support. It can take a lot of training. There's a lot of ramping up. There's a lot of exchange between organizations. So let's talk about the work that you're doing in your areas to develop that that ecosystem. And we're going to start with Deyanira about your shared services model and work like that in New York City.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, as I think you've heard, we've been working really closely together as a field, as a movement for a dozen years. And it's through the coalition and campaign organizing. It's also through a 2-year, pretty in-depth learning exchange we did with a cohort of about a dozen CLTs from 2017 to 2019. We worked with enterprise community partners on that, as well as HPD, our housing agency, and others. We've been continuing to follow this model of having groups do teachbacks and share their learning, their successes, their challenges with each other. We do learning exchanges with groups all over the country, as I mentioned, and also building up capacity through training and technical assistance. We have the coalition includes a technical assistance network of legal services groups, including Take Root Justice and our CUNY. There's divisions in CUNY that have been long supporting our city college here, supporting emerging community land trusts, and many others. So there's a lot of support organizations, as you heard, that are shoring up and really working to strengthen the amazing grassroots work that the CLTs themselves are doing. Building on all of that, we're now designing a sort of a deeper shared services model that is really meant to support these community land trusts as they reach their next stages of growth, supporting their long-term sustainability, and helping them build scale and capacity, while very critically making sure that the model, the collaboration preserves authentic community control. That's super important to us. I think if we're in still a nascent stage of planning for what we're calling shared services as a shorthand, but I want to underscore it's incredibly important for us that this is grassroots designed and that it's really supporting the neighborhood-led organizing and planning, all of that deep work that's at the heart of the CLT model. Without that, I think we won't have success. And I think we're all aligned in that page. So what we're thinking about is, as all of these groups are growing, how do we build collective infrastructure capacity so that every grassroots group around the city, it's a big city, but still, we don't want 20 tiny organizations all having to, hit the same walls, learn the same lessons, build the same, capacity, replicate the same wheels. How do we sort of collectively come together and figure out how to streamline some of that? Can we centralize certain functions, maybe have some shared staffing so that groups can, have a backbone kind of, organization that they go to for support? Can we put together a list of vetted consultants that then we cultivate and train so that they know how to work with community land trusts specifically? They understand how that model works. We're looking at other pieces as well, maybe developing a distinct organization entity that can really focus on the financing needs of community land trusts. And so what we've done so far is have these one-on-one kind of needs assessments, learning about groups' interests, their needs, their strengths, and what their priorities would be for collaboration at this kind of operational level. We've done a ton of learning with and from other CLT collaborations around the country, from practitioners involved in those efforts. I saw John Davis was here, who has been a great resource over the years for us on this topic. We've also connected with other CLT networks around the country to learn about, their experiences and what's worked, what challenges have they hit. We have, secured pro bono legal support for the project, and we're right now with partners designing what we hope will become a pilot that can launch soon, where we're testing some of these approaches to see what works, to work out kinks, and figure out a feasible long-term structure. I think one of the things that we are really excited about is that we have this long history and close relationships built over this very deep work together through the New York City Community Land Initiative, through the funding initiatives that we all take part in, and other existing collaborations. So, that's just a really critical piece of, something that feels very maybe intangible, but is really core to structuring this kind of long-term collaboration. So that's what we're working on, in addition to making sure we have robust policy and funding support and all the other resources that CLTs need to sustain and continue to thrive over the long term.
Thank you. It's exciting to see that happening, because we've seen that idea come up over time in the past, but always in places where the central organization that's providing the services was created before there was a critical mass of CLTs present. And it seems like, even though it makes sense in some ways to have the support present before the local organizing, it seems like maybe having the energy of the local organizing and that critical mass first, maybe the
Yeah.
direction.
Yeah, when the coalition first formed, it considered that and explicitly decided against that for those, for reasons that I think you're alluding to, which is that we wanted to make sure that whatever took shape was responsive to the grassroots CLTs getting off the ground. And so that's where the coalition really has directed the bulk of its energy, is, all of the training, the organizing, the education and outreach, and just really making sure that we have robust, well-structured grassroots CLTs, helping those, organic community-led efforts succeed first. And now we're sort of ready to now plan up. So appreciate that.
That's great. Before we go on, I just want to remind folks to throw questions in the chat, because we'll be coming around to questions soon. And I'm going to go over to Roberto. You've mentioned the LA Housing Training Hub, and now you don't have to put it off anymore. Tell us about it.
No, yeah, thank you. No, yeah, before I get started, I think a lot of the hub or like conversations about capacity building have been happening in LA for some time. I mentioned the pilot program earlier. Part of that pilot program was to convert these developments into resident owned models or community owned models. Only one of them out of 8 buildings were able to convert within the timeline that we had talked about. And I think one of the reflections we had was just that there was a lot of gap within the ecosystem in LA around capacity building, around being able to train not only residents but also organizations in like this shift from this like tenant landlord relationship, even within like an affordable housing model, to then really get your property management, get your asset management on board, to really see the residents as part owners or decision makers, right? And so as we were writing ULA and we thinking about how we were going to implement ULA, even before it passed, a lot of us went down a rabbit hole around like, well, where do we find the right models to learn from? Some of us went to Vienna, and Vienna just felt super distant, right? And then for us, a very practical example and clear example for us was like reading about UHAB in New York City, and like thinking about all the units they have developed and turned into limited equity housing co-ops, and really thinking about like, how do they do that? How do they sustain that for decades? Not just and specifically like how did this like investment from the city like really become long term, and not just the life of the tax credit, not just the life of that, but really thinking about the people and the capacity building and the institutions that needed to be built out. And so for us, that's where the LA Housing Training Hub is really inspired. The guidelines, we're really thinking about ensuring that these developments didn't just have capital, but that they were going to require support around governance infrastructure, like resident capacity, ongoing technical assistance, long-term like operations planning, and legal and financial like expertise um, to really kind of sustain. And so without that sort of infrastructure, we knew that even the most well-funded projects were going to struggle. And one of the big struggles that we saw was risk mission drift. Like one of the things that I learned in like doing this research, but also thinking and doing research in LA around like where all the mutual housing associations went, or where are the limited equity housing co-ops that existed, what happened? And a lot of them went back into the market. Um, and they reverted to the market rate kind of logic after like equity had been built. And so for us, these are kind of some of the contexts that we're really thinking about as we're thinking of scale. So the LA Housing Training Hub is a collaborative of organizations in LA. It's still not its own institution, but its mission is to provide technical assistance and training programs that grow LA's social housing ecosystem. We do this by empowering historically marginalized low to moderate income and BIPOC residents to collectively govern and make decisions about their housing in partnership with land stewards, housing developers, and property managers. We think this is, we think the hub is really important because in LA, there hasn't been an investment in collective ownership and governance in decades. And what I mean by that is that there hasn't been a space for trainings where like tenants who are organizing their building to learn what the pathway is to buy their building. And it's very similar to the conversations we're having about TOPA, right? Um, and also like building knowledge and systems for residents, developers, and community-based organizations to collaborate in sustaining a limited equity housing co-op or sustaining a strong resident council in an affordable housing development building. And so for us, I think this is like really important because they're just like, this is an opportunity, a really important one, where there is funding to really build out like a system and infrastructure that has been missing in the equation to build an ecosystem. So like I said, the hub will offer training and tools for governance, budgeting, and operations for the developer and for the tenants. Technical assistance from like pre-development through operations, and then leadership development for resident decision making. We know that governance is really important, and even after a governing body is built out, maybe like 10 years, 5 years from now, there's going to be a shift in leadership, and new leadership needs to be developed in these buildings and within this ecosystem. And then compliance and monitoring systems for long-term sustainability. We don't want to see a co-op. We don't want to see a resident council fall out of compliance because they didn't have the training for it, because they didn't have the support, because they didn't have the right monitoring tools to ensure when a document needed to be submitted or when they needed to have an election. A lot of these sometimes are very simple, but really make a difference in terms of the survival of a co-op or a resident council. And so for us, as we understood our ecosystem in LA, we knew we needed partners. And the way we applied for the RFP or the request for proposal from the city was creating a collaborative of multiple organizations. And so we brought in a respected foundation to be our administrator, which is the Liberty Hill Foundation here in LA. Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre is like the staff host and really kind of host of the leadership for the hub. Um, and then we brought like two big organizations that work with affordable housing developers, which is ACT LA, and the SCAMP, which is the Southern California Alliance for Nonprofit Professionals, I think. Um, and then of course we needed to have other CLT, so we brought in Beverly Vermont Community Land Trust um, as our local trainer. And then we brought some outsider folks from LA who are allies, like folks really committed to this. One is the California Center for Cooperative Development, and really, and then the other one is You Have New York. So if we wanted to build something like You Have, we needed You Have to be with us. You Have was really clear, like we're not gonna open You Have California, or we're not going to open You Have LA, but we're going to support you in building out the institution that you need. And we thought that was like really helpful. And now it's been like a 2 to 3 year collaboration with them, and we've been sending folks to their National Training Institute. I'm a graduate of it. Also with the California Center for Cooperative Development, we've gone through their trainings. We're collaborating more in terms of making sure that there's more capacity here in LA. And at the moment, the LA Housing Training Hub hasn't launched, and we're really close. We've been selected, and right now we're trying to, cross the finish line in ensuring that we have a contract. And this would be a 4-year contract for us to be able to build out this work, build out the institution, move out of this like collaborative and more into a formal organization. Um, and um, and yeah, like I think that's a little bit of what the LA Housing Training Hub is. And I think just to say, like, my hope through this is um, that we move from like isolated projects, because when I started this work, so especially like when I started Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre, it felt like it was like these like pocket like projects that were happening around like building a CLT and like having to fundraise for it, having to think about all the internal capacity, having to, and sometimes it felt like we were replicating that. We built the LA CLT Coalition. The LA CLT Coalition now shares resources, interacts, fundraises together, does all these things. But now with the LA Housing Training Hub, now it's time to really build out a robust ecosystem of community ownership in LA that can really scale and replicate the type of developments we want. And it's not just like a CLT development. Like, yes, like I think priority should be for CLTs always, for me, in my opinion. But if an affordable housing developer wants to move in to this sort of ecosystem, at least they're gonna do it in a way that's like guided through experts. If they're gonna, consider doing limited equity housing co-ops, resident councils, or allowing tenant associations in to really organize in their buildings through building out a governing structure in their building, they're gonna really need the support and the infrastructure to sustain that. And I think NeighborWorks is a really good place to start. But then, like, what happens after your NeighborWorks contract ends? At least the city will now have a place to really kind of sustain all these different approaches to community ownership, alternative housing models, and shared equity models. And so that's that in a way, in the sense, is why we're building the LA Housing Training Hub.
Wonderful. We have got some really great questions coming up. I just want to see if, Chris, did you have anything you wanted to add on the infrastructure and training front?
Not unless people have specific questions about it.
We will jump into some of these questions then. So first we have a question from Australia, and I'm going to pair it with another question because they're both about the loan fund, the New Economy Project loan fund. The one question is, where do the funds come from for it? Access to finance is a big challenge in Australia for doing this work. And then the other question is, since you mentioned doing loans for acquisition and pre-development, how has the process been for finding permanent financing for both CLTs and co-ops, and what sets borrowers up to be able to get that funding?
Yes, thank you. And I tried answering the second question. It's hard to keep up with the chat. Uh, our loan fund is so far it's been largely capitalized with donated capital from donors that are not seeking a return, but rather have restricted the funds for use as revolving capital that they want to see revolve to different community ownership projects. And it actually is an outgrowth of two prior loan funds that we operated. One was a revolving loan fund for deferred action applicants, immigrant New Yorkers that were eligible to apply for deferred action when that policy was created in 2012. And it was meant to overcome some of the financial obstacles that were preventing people from applying and getting relief, immigration relief, and work authorization and such. That was a zero interest revolving fund that we then converted into grants when the first Trump administration moved to end the program. Before that, we had created in 2008 a foreclosure prevention gap loan program with a couple of local community development lenders, two community development credit unions that we partnered, or one that we partnered with, and another loan fund as well. To make very low cost and deferred mortgages to homeowners that had been at risk of foreclosure because of predatory subprime loans. And so that's how we initially generated the capital. And then when we wound down those programs, and in the case of the foreclosure fund, worked with the city and state to scale that up into a public financing program, we were able to move our donated capital over into this new economy loan fund. So that's what we've been using. And then, as we've generated interest, a little bit of interest that's grown, we're also, like I said, secured some CDFI fund, Community Development Financial Institution Fund support, mostly for capacity building. And we're at the moment now talking with other donors as well as foundations about ways they can support and help us grow the fund. So yeah, we're a little unique in that way, and we've been, passing along that no cost of funds into, zero or close to zero interest rate loans.
So there's a question that open to any of you who have thoughts. The zoning commission in DC is on the verge of a massive upzoning of a certain area around Connecticut and Wisconsin Avenue, and the tenant opportunity to purchase won't apply because they're new buildings for the next 15 years. Do you have thoughts about what could be demanded of the zoning commission to lay the groundwork for some community ownership in this area so that the benefit of that upzoning doesn't just all go to private speculators?
I'll be brave and say that I do not. I would. That's really, yeah, it's sticky with the newly developed buildings. If there's not something baked in at the ground level, it's really hard to get. Oh, sorry, it's just Deyanira reweighing in. Okay. I thought maybe you knew something that I didn't. I was about to learn something awesome. Yeah, that's really hard to do when it's new builds like that. But that's a great question to generate some research on our end, because I think you're probably going to see that pop up in quite a few places.
While the others are thinking, I will just say that the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy would probably say this is an opportunity for what they call value capture, which is to say the government is creating the extra benefit here by the upzoning, and so they do have a right to demand something in return for it, and that's the framing that I would bring into whatever conversation you would be looking for, whether it's inclusion of affordable housing or some funding of something or a different model of the Opportunity to Purchase Act. But it certainly can be a hard lift. But that's the concept that that I think a lot of us want to have out there is when the public sector generates value, the public sector should get something back for the public good. So this question has had some discussion in the chat, but I just wanted to bring it up for everybody to hear, which is, we've been talking a lot about CLTs. What about housing co-ops? And I know that you have, which is the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board, which Roberto mentioned, actually works and has worked primarily with housing co-ops. So can you guys talk a little bit about how those two models are still active and work together?
Yeah, and I think there's like a resurging of the model. Like I think it's always been around. Here in LA, it's always really interesting when we meet with a limited equity housing co-op that has been around for like 30 years and has been like run by working class like immigrant families, and it just demonstrates how good it is. And I think in the past, uh, the limited equity housing, at least in California, it's just like uh, housing co-ops are just really difficult to one build and then to continue with compliance, because of just like legal jargon and legal procedures that need to happen. But I think we're still very hopeful that that could really be built out. And I think here, when you match, at least like when you match a co-op and a CLT, it really creates a really good formula, because the CLT brings in the permanent affordability and the long-term stewardship, and then the co-op really builds in decision-making, resident ownership, and governance of the structure. And I think for us, like those are ideal like matches, and we are trying to really figure out. And like I said, like I think LA still needs to produce a regulatory agreement for when ULA is used for limited equity co-ops. And for us, we want to make like we want to make sure that it makes it not much harder. It doesn't make it harder for tenants to meet compliance, and that it actually makes like it really kind of allows working class people to own their buildings. And so for me, I think as the hub grows and as we start doing our work, I think it's going to be really important to uplift that and to encourage not just CLTs to use the model, but to even encourage nonprofit affordable housing developers to use the model as well.
Did you want to add anything to that, Deyanira?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think the big takeaway, I realized we just dived in and didn't really explain how community land trust works, so I'm sorry for that. That was really a missed opportunity there. But I would say that the core thing to understand is that it is a flexible model that can work with all sorts of housing types and all sorts of other development on top. And that's been a real huge focus in New York, is making sure that policymakers and funders and city and state agencies understand that it's housing and much more. And that it includes deeply affordable rental housing. It can be shared equity or limited equity cooperatives. In New York City, we have a lot of co-ops. Most of them are not low income, but the ones that are, there's like different formulas to protect the affordability. And that's the part that Roberto was talking about, that the CLTs can make sure these co-ops are actually adhering to those restrictions and, maintaining reserves for the building and, doing all sorts of compliance, making sure that the buildings stay compliant with regulatory agreements and things like that. I think everyone here knows that the CLTs just have that layer of protection. And so it works with all the different models, and depending on neighborhoods and, your specific place where you're working, there might be different models in addition.
So we have another question about what do you think does and doesn't work in creating stronger and more diverse coalitions to push for more permanently affordable housing models? So, for example, rural farmers and urban workers working together.
I can speak to some of that because it's sort of the question that I punted on in exchange for going right into the Q&A.
Awesome.
I've got to be honest, when you're addressing diverse stakeholders who may or may not all be on the same page about, do we even have an affordable housing crisis? And if we do, what does the Overton window look like, right? As far as these are the things that we are willing to do to enact policy prescriptions. One of the best things to do, or one of the things that I found most effective, is to really have your data in order and have it across both space and time. So what I mean by that is in space, you can either speak to specifically your area and how your area compares to your region, your state, the nation, whatever the case may be. And then time is really important. If you tell someone right now 50% of our county is housing cost burden, that doesn't mean as much to them as if you tell them right now 50% of our county is housing cost burdened, and 10 years ago it was 20%. Right now you're kind of contextualizing it. What's been really helpful here is actually part of what's been really harmful. Increasingly, these stories become personalized because the policymakers that you're talking to have children who can't afford to move back to the area they grew up in, or they've got children who can't afford to move out of the house, right? There's a sort of tongue-in-cheek term that we've coined here, naturally occurring intergenerational housing. That's literally just your 23-year-old son can't find an apartment, right? That's naturally occurring intergenerational housing. So making it personal has worked really well. When making it kind of broadly emotional hasn't worked. But there are some real economic benefits specifically to community land trusts. It is one of the most economically efficient versions of affordable housing that you could possibly think of. The idea is that if your usual period of affordability is 10 or 15 years, you have to go out and find a subsidy for the next family every time you build a new unit. If you've got a CLT where you sort of have this secondary market or alternative market of homes that are always there, you don't have to have as many fights as you would if you didn't have that kind of alternate economy set up. I think there was a broader question in here about the Nordic model's history, and I know Roberto name-checked Vienna before. This comes up a lot, and it comes up in a lot of different contexts. A lot of the policy prescriptions from other countries work because they've got very different marginal tax rates and very different ideas about what gets taxed and what doesn't, and how that tax money gets used. So I guess I would caution a little bit, just be aware of what can you fix at the level that you're operating at, and then what's going to be a lever that you need to lean on a little bit longer. I don't think we're going to approach like a Vienna type tax policy at a national level. But I know that there are things like, in New York State, we've got the Social Housing Development Authority bill that has come up a couple of times, which is basically Mitchell-Lama 2.0, I think is one of the ways that it is very often referred to. And that's, that is the state using public dollars to create housing that it itself will manage. And we've done it before, we could do it again. So I would say that there aren't too many brand new ideas out here. Even community land trusts have been around for, at this point, 60 years, just about, a little bit longer.
I'll say that one pretty radical for this country idea that we're pushing in New York City and state is the idea of a public bank. And there's a whole separate city and statewide coalition that's been pushing for that in New York, but it includes a lot of the community land trusts and the other kind of, community wealth building initiatives around the city and state that really see public banks as a way to add more firepower, more resources, into this work. And the idea is that, cities or states, right, could use their public dollars, their deposits that right now are held at the big banks that largely are not investing in local communities or certainly not in community ownership, in many places, by putting deposits into a public bank that's chartered to invest in these kinds of initiatives and in local economic development. It's a way that the city can leverage its deposits, its funding to work for the public good. So I have to put that out there. And I'll just say that the other thing is, we've done a lot of broad coalition building, not just with community land trusts and the sort of base building groups that often form the CLTs, but also bringing it into our policy coalitions. For example, the dozens and dozens of nonprofit developers, the community development corporations, and others around the city, and their trade association into the campaigns, right? Because in many cases, the community land trusts are going to partner with those or other mission aligned developers on the project. So that's been really important. Also, again, like the building with the tenant movement, with labor groups, with other environmental justice and youth groups. We've actually had this really powerful youth coalition put COPA that I talked about earlier as one of their top priorities, and they've been adding a lot of amazing youthful energy into the campaign as well. So I think just wanted to add those ideas into the mix as well.
Great. Thank you. I think that that's a great note to end on, those expansive ideas about where we can be going forward. So I want to thank all of the participants and everybody who's been engaging in the chat and asking useful and interesting questions, and for all the work that you guys are doing. If you found this webinar useful, if you found the Under the Lens series about community ownership useful, please consider dropping us a donation at shelterforce.org/donate, and keep up the good work. Thank you all.